In the Ballot Brief today, we're looking at media freedom in 30 years of democracy. The upcoming national and provincial elections have been described as the most pivotal in post-apartheid South Africa.
So what is the role of the media now? We're joined by the author, the journalist and producer, Hamilton Wende. He's been reporting on our elections and from many areas around the world. Hamilton, good afternoon to you, and thank you very much indeed for coming in. First, you will have been watching, like we have today on Newzroom Afrika channel 405, the arguments over Gaza at the International Court of Justice. You actually covered a genocide in Rwanda.
Correct.
I'm sure when you've been watching these arguments, watching this play out, you must have some views on what's happening.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that there can be no question that severe human rights abuses are taking place in Gaza. And whether it's actually legally a genocide, I think we'll have to leave that to the court. But, you know, every genocide, every massacre is different. I mean, what happened in Cambodia was completely different to what happened in Rwanda. Of course, the original genocide in the 20th century, the Holocaust, was an industrialized gassing of people. So I think one has to look at it within the context of what's happening there, and I think that there is a powerful case to be made.
So one of the things, well, certainly speaking from people who are really engaged in what is happening in Palestine, is that though slowly perhaps, certainly according to them, the tide is turning. One of the big difficulties is that often the criticism of Israel is conflated with anti-Semitism. And even though this struggle could have moved, certainly, over the past, a couple of years, the big difficulty is that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anti-Semitism is real. And at the same time, the weaponization of anti-Semitism for propaganda purposes by certain right-wing forces in Israel is also real. So I think it's been very clear in South Africa that, we're not anti-Semitic. I think there are anti-Semitic individuals. I think there are anti-Semitic policies in some countries. But absolutely, the line must be drawn. This is not about Jewish people. It's about Israeli policies. And I think that's very clear.
One of the things that's really important in Gaza is that journalists are not allowed in. It's very difficult to actually report. And it seems to me, it's a really clear indication of one of the strengths of South Africa is the transparency, which is because of media freedom. And because of that, it's very hard for anyone to actually do anything wrong and get away with it. And often you'll see someone try and do something wrong, and suddenly, you'll see on a WhatsApp group near you the document that proves it was them. How important is that for South Africa now?
Well, it's vital. I started my journalism career in the 1980s, 1983 at Wits University, when the police used to come onto campus with tear gas, sjamboks, and you watch them beating young women students ruthlessly. And on the black campuses and in Soweto, they were shooting at people. And that was a function of apartheid. Whites were treated differently, even in that level of oppression. So coming from that to what we have today, where we are an extremely free country to work in, is something I think South Africans can be unequivocally proud of and grateful for, that we have that media freedom. If you remember back, and I don't remember the details, but Jacob Zuma and the penis and all of that stuff, nobody was put in jail, nobody was detained, nobody disappeared. People didn't like it, they didn't approve of it, they thought it was disrespectful, all of those things, but the freedom of expression remained, and I don't think we should. Well, I think we should not lose sight of that. It's critical to our country and to our democracy, and we're doing well at it.
You mentioning sjamboks reminds me of the stories that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How the SABC was the only reference point then. Television broadcasting, in fact, in the main, was done by the SABC, and workers apparently would choose if you did something for which you had to be disciplined or punished. You could choose between being dismissed or being sjamboked. And this was like, within this. Of course, there were other stories of spies in the newsrooms. Some of them wielding guns, and yet these were people. But of course, we've come a long way, since that era. But have we served the craft well over the past 30 years?
I think we've done extremely well. I think South African journalists are brave, they're courageous, they're committed, I think our biggest problem, and it's one that newsrooms face across the world, is the lack of funds. I mean, one of my frustrations with a lot of stories in South Africa is you don't get a repeated follow-through, perhaps not day after day, but even week after week over certain stories. And you see a big splash, and the money was spent. I don't know, I'm not an editor, so I don't know how you decide where to spend your money. But that is our biggest problem, and that's why we've dropped a little bit on the, or quite significantly, on the World Press Freedom Index. It's not because of our laws, it's not because of our government, it's because of our lack of financial resources, which is affecting the way people do journalism. So that is a big problem, and I don't have an immediate solution to it.
It's interesting because, I mean, you, of course, would have been one of the people that came through the 1980s, through the 1994 election in South Africa. It must have been such a contrast going from Rwanda to here in that time, from the sort of most awful despair of humanity to a time, I think, of great hope for humanity, the end of the Cold War, the beginning of something new here in South Africa. But technology's changed hugely as well. In those days, there was sort of mediated kind of journalism through television, through radio and writing. Now, everyone thinks they're a journalist on X and they all have a view. I mean, things have changed dramatically from a technological point of view.
Well, there's value in that and there's danger in that. When I was I actually went the other way. I went from South African elections to the genocide in Rwanda. Then the only way you could get live television pictures out was with a big satellite dish and a generator, a big generator. So it was impossible to cover Rwanda the way Gaza's being covered today. So that has the disadvantage that, yes, it's mediated through a certain editorial, perhaps, or viewpoint, or even just the limitations of technology create a viewpoint. However, just having people putting out whatever they see is valuable at times, because they're there with a cell phone and they see things we don't see. But it can also become quite misleading because it's not carefully thought out, or increasingly it's false or untrue or manipulated by AI. And that's where mediated journalism, like you guys are practicing, like I practice, is very useful, because the viewer or the reader can trust that that is not happening. And that's powerful, is having that trust.
Of course, I was 11 years old when, on the 19th of October, 1977, the government decided to close down newspapers, ban journalists, and so on. But, I mean, 30 years into democracy, you now have newspapers that are not being banned, they are not being closed down for the same reasons that the apartheid government did, but we have lots of titles closing down, fewer and fewer employment opportunities. Yet this is coming at a time when people thought we would leapfrog because of technology, we'd be able to do more, launch more titles and all of that, but that is not really happening.
Well, it's difficult, and I'm not a new media expert in terms of how to make it pay. But I do think that one sign that is quite interesting and significant is that increasingly difficult to get news, good news, meaningful news for free on the internet. You've got to subscribe, you've got to pay for it. I think that's very valuable. The sort of hippie idea of the internet being this freewheeling space, I think we've lost that, and I think it has moved on. So, I mean, the New York Times is a very good example of a very old legacy paper that has turned itself into probably the most successful internet media, cell phone media outlet in the world. And they've pursued it. And if you subscribe to the New York Times and you say to them it's too expensive, they'll come back to you within seconds, really, and saying, can we offer you a deal? They really are responsive. They really believe in getting... News 24, I think, is doing very well. Daily Maverick, which I write for, is growing in leaps and bounds. I know they're struggling for money. They recently shut the paper, if you want to call it that, for a day. But that creates awareness. And so I think we're okay. It's not... when I started as a television journalist, we only ever flew business class. We only ever stayed in five-star hotels. I mean, that was just normal. It was almost part of the entertainment business. No journalists do that anymore. We stay in bed and breakfast. We fly the red-eye 6 a.m. flight. So, the reality of it has changed.
Hamilton Wende, nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Journalist, author, and producer.